Inhabitants of the Tyneside region are undoubtedly familiar with the 19th century song The Blaydon Races. It describes a journey from Newcastle city centre to Blaydon to see the races, as you might imagine, and even became immortalised in art. The song is traditionally sung in the local Geordie dialect, although over time some of the language has softened to make it more easily understood by outsiders. Now sung at football and rugby events in the area, the song preserves a slice of history and the characters that populated the area at the time. Given this month's focus on exploring a city's folk life through its history, looking at a folk song that came to represent the city seems the ideal subject for an episode. But what are the Blaydon Races, and why did they end up being the subject of a music hall song? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult, and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author, and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing, like I said in the introduction, with this month's theme, which is basically looking at that intersection of folk traditions, folklore, folk life, all that kind of stuff with local history. And my case study, as you might imagine, as I am a proud Geordie, is Newcastle upon Tyne. And I am very heartened a lot of the time when I do episodes about Newcastle history and people who either have chosen to make their home here, in which case you're automatically a Geordie, and people who don't live here but are just generally interested have enjoyed the content that I've put out anyway. So it's nice to know that even if people have never visited Newcastle, they still find the content interesting enough to interact with it, to engage with it, and all that kind of thing. So thank you very much for all your lovely comments on last week's episode about fire, flood and plague. This week's episode is a lot more fun, as you might imagine. I had quite a lot of fun researching it as well, because the Blaydon Races is one of those things that you sort of feel like you come out of the womb knowing. If you're a Geordie, you just know it. And obviously by Geordie, this is clearly a really wide definition. Nobody can really agree on what a Geordie actually is. Like, where do you come from to be considered a Geordie? But I think in this particular instance, it's mostly people who are along the Tyne on either side of it. So Tyneside, as you might imagine, does include north and south. So this is Newcastle and Gateshead, because Blaydon is on the Gateshead side, just to get that one out of the way straight away. But I thought I might as well jump in and have a look at what are the Blaydon Races that the song is actually about. So the Blaydon Races were horse races that were held in Blaydon. And I know that might sound like I'm being really obvious there, but you might not have known there were horse races. So there we go, because there is a Blaydon race now, but we will come back to that later on. Blaydon lies on the southern banks of the River Tyne. Blaydon railway station now stands on the original site of the races. Now, it is unclear when the first race was held. I did find one source that said 1811, but I couldn't verify that against any other sources, so I wouldn't say definitively it was 1811 because I don't know where that source got their information from, but that was the earliest one that I found. Although it does appear that the Blaydon races were part of the Win-Leighton hopping, because the song Win-Leighton Hopping from around 1830 mentions the Blaydon races. So we can at least say that they must have been around in the first few decades of the 19th century in order to make it into that particular song. And a newspaper article from 1860 in the Newcastle Guardian also referenced the Blaydon races being held 30 years previously at the Blaydon Hopping, with the races being part of the event. Now, that is not the hoppings when I'm saying Win-Leighton or Blaydon Hopping, because the hoppings were most famously held on the Town Moor in Newcastle, and there is an episode about the Town Moor which does go into them in more depth. But hoppings was the word given to annual fairs held around Whitsun, which begins on the 7th Sunday after Easter. And in Northumberland and Durham, the term then went on to refer to any kind of, and I quote, feast, merry meeting, dancing, or parish wake, end quote. So the Blaydon hoppings, and indeed the Win-Leighton hoppings, were very much their own event, and that's where the races were part of them. According to the piece in the Newcastle Guardian, Blaydon Guards, and I quote, was at that day acknowledged to be on the best racecourses on Tyneside, end quote. Sadly, the arrival of the railway cut through the site and the races ended in 1835. So we don't really know, as I say, how long they were going on for at that point, but it does seem like it was at least a few years. Luckily, you can't hold Geordies down, so locals started making plans in 1859 to bring back the races, and by 1860 they'd moved to Blaydon Island in the River Tyne. Boats ferried passengers across with tents put up to provide refreshments. But yes, there were islands in the Tyne, and we're going to come back to them in just a little second because it's a weird concept, but as I say, stick with us. But in 1861, a dance at the Mechanics' Hall in Blaydon ended the day, and it was the success of the races in 1861 that guaranteed their repeat the following year on 9th of June 1862. And that year proved to be something of a watershed moment because that is the year that Geordie Ridley performed a new song at the dance, the Blaydon Races. But we will come back to that later on. Now, this revival of the races only continued until 1865, but the dredging of the Tyne destroyed Blaydon Island, which was also known as Dense Meadow. So without a site, the races again disappeared. So the Tyne Improvement Commission launched a dredging programme in 1861 to deepen the river, and that meant removing islands, mudbanks or shallows that might make navigation difficult. Dense Meadow was one such island, as was Kingsmeadows Island, which was opposite Elsick. And this island was so big it actually boasted a popular pub, and the landlady's cows provided milk for Elsick, which was then a village. So it is very, very odd, if you are familiar with the Tyne at all, to try and imagine islands large enough for people to have grazing cows on them or horse races on them in the middle of the Tyne. It is a bit of a weird concept, but there we go, that is history for you. In 1889, locals tried a final revival at Stella Hoffs west of the original site. They were popular for a few years, but attendance began to drop in the late 1890s. Officials ended them in 1916 after a controversial result caused civil unrest, and it seems the favourite and winner of the opening race, a horse called Anxious Moments, was disqualified for apparently being underweight, with the win then handed to the runner-up Genie. Those who backed Anxious Moments stormed the weighing room, so the stewards then declared the race void in an attempt to quell the growing anger. Now this just further angered Genie's backers, and the whole scene turned into a riot. The Newcastle Daily Chronicle noted that, and I quote, "Owners got their horses away while the disturbance was going on, and the discreet portion of the crowd left the course," end quote, when it became clear that no more racing would take place. And that was the end of the Blaydon Races in terms of horse racing. William C. Irving actually painted the event in 1903, so obviously this is while they were still going on, and included local characters in his famous painting, and that is what I've used as the image for this particular episode. So if you're watching on YouTube, that's what you're looking at. And at the front of the painting is an example. We see the card cheat known as the Swalwell Cat, who's tricking Gull Willie of Newburn. You can actually see the painting at the Shipley Art Gallery in Gateshead, and big thanks to North East Museums for making the image available online. But like I say, the races did live on, and part of it was because the song became an unofficial Tyneside anthem, often sung at sporting events. So just a few days ago, I actually heard it sung at the Newcastle Red Bulls ground. The races themselves got a new lease of life in 1981 when James Dewar, part of Blaydon Harrier and Athletics Club, set up a new race for runners. They follow the route described in the song every 9th of June. 212 runners took part in the first race, and they now limit it to 5,000 spots, which sell out quickly. In 2023, the Lord Mayor of Newcastle, Veronica Dunn, used the same handbell that started the races in 1861 to start the 2023 race. And the bell is usually kept in the Discovery Museum, so that's very cool. But on to the song, because that's probably why you're listening to this. And Geordie Ridley set the lyrics to the tune of the American song On the Road to Brighton, referring to Brighton, Massachusetts, not Brighton in England. And this earlier song from 1858 was written by Lon Morris and was very popular with minstrel shows, although the use of blackface by the performers relied heavily on racist stereotypes, which is obviously unacceptable. So Ridley got rid of all of that kind of stuff and just simply borrowed the tune, but then added his own lyrics which focused on this journey from Newcastle to Blaydon. He first performed the song at Bamborough's Music Hall on the 5th of June 1862, but then added a final verse at the show on 9th of June at Wickham Mechanics Institute. And what's really funny is in one of the verses he actually mentions Geordie Ridley's concert in the Mechanics Hall in Blaydon, so he's basically referencing himself in a song well before Lady Gaga ever did it. The Newcastle Daily Chronicle referred to him as, and I quote, a noted singer of Tyneside songs, end quote, before describing the song as, and I quote, descriptive of a journey in prospect by road to the ensuing Blaydon Races, end quote. Ridley also immortalised Bamborough's Music Hall in the song itself, So the lyrics mention taking a bus from Bamborough's, and this refers to John Bamborough, who turned part of his Wheatsheaf pub into a music hall. So at that time, the pubs would often put entertainment on, but Bamborough went one further and actually turned part of the pub into a music hall. So there was obviously a better draw for punters to come and see things. The Wheatsheaf was then referred to as Bamborough's because it was his pub. The Wheatsheaf stood in the Cloth Market and was actually renamed Bamborough's Music Hall in 1962 to mark the song's centenary. And interestingly enough, my late uncle's country group actually used to play there in the 1960s, and from what my mum says, they were very good. Over the years, Bamborough's became a Motown theme bar, but it was badly damaged by fire in 2014. Plans were afoot in 2020 to restore the building, and so far they have replaced the signage to match the original sign from the 1900s. And there were plans to use it as a pop-up bar so the building would return to public use, but I suspect the pandemic put paid to those. I would quite like to see it actually being used as a museum for Northeast music, because when you consider how much has actually come out of the region, but we do have quite a lot of almost lost Tyneside music, which has never quite reached the same heights as the Blaydon Races. I think it would be a really nice way to preserve that. And obviously it is the place that basically made the Blaydon Races as a song famous, so it would be quite cool to preserve it for that as well. Now, I did manage to find one set of original lyrics as given in Allen's illustrated edition of Tyneside Songs and Readings that was published in 1891, and it is entirely written in the Geordie dialect. So what does it actually sound like? So what I will do is I am going to sing the first verse and the chorus, but I'm not going to do the rest of the song because, you know, that's going to be like 3 or 4 minutes or something. So as I say, if you think I've got a horrible singing voice, please don't tell me, because I just feel like that would be mean. And I don't usually sing in public for various reasons. So I'm only doing this for the dint of preserving folk music, or at least sharing the Blaydon Races with a wider audience. If you're keen to hear the whole song by someone else, you can no doubt find it on YouTube. But this is what the first verse and the chorus sound like. I went to Blaydon Races, 'twas on the 9th of June, 1862, on a summer's afternoon. I took the bus for Bamborough's and she was heavy laden. Away we went along Collingwood Street, that's on the road to Blaydon. Ah, me lads, you should have seen we're gunning. We passed the folks along the road just as they were standing. There was lots of lads and lasses there, all with smiling faces, gunning along the Scotswood Road to see the Blaydon Races. And then you tend to hear people just repeating the chorus ad infinitum. Just for posterity though, I will at least recite the lyrics for the rest of the song. And I am actually going to do it in English because it's obviously a lot easier to sing it in Geordie, but actually reciting it in Geordie actually is a little bit difficult and also probably incomprehensible to people who are listening. So after he's given you first verse where he's talking about going along Scotswood Road to see the Blaydon Races, and you get the chorus, he then says, we flew past Armstrong's factory and up to the Robin Adair. Just going down the railway bridge, the bus wheel flew off there. The lasses lost their crinolines and the veils that hid their faces, and I got 2 black eyes and a broken nose going to the Blaydon Races. Then you get the chorus. When we got the wheel put on, away we went again, but them that had their noses broke, they came back over Hiem meaning home, by the way, just obviously because that has to rhyme. Some went to the dispensary and others to Dr. Gibbs, and some sought out the infirmary to mend their broken ribs. Then the chorus. Now when we got to Paradise, there was bonny game begun. There was 24 on the bus, man, how they danced and sung. They called on me to sing a song, I sung them Paddy Fagan, and danced the jig and swung my twig, that day I went to Blaydon. Then the chorus. We flew across the chain bridge right into Blaydon town. The bellman he was calling there, they call him Jackie Brown. I saw him talking to some chaps and them he was persuading to go and see Geordie Ridley's concert at the Mechanics Hall in Blaydon. Then the chorus, and then the final verse. The rain it poured all the day and made the ground quite muddy. Coffee Johnny had a white hat on, they were shouting who stole the cuddy. There was spice stalls and monkey shows and old wives selling ciders, and a chap with a halfpenny roundabout shouting no me lads for riders. And then the chorus again. Clearly the Geordie dialect is not one that is particularly well captured in writing, as it's largely a spoken dialect, and I have softened that one slightly so you can hopefully understand it a little bit better. And NUFC actually shared a more user-friendly version for fans in 2009, whose chorus reads, oh me lads, you should have seen us ganning, passing the folks along the road just as they were standing. All the lads and lasses there, all with smiling faces, gan along the Scotswood Road to see the Blaydon Races. And Scotswood Road is still there, so it's quite a major thoroughfare, in fact, along the Tyne. most of the time you will only hear people singing the chorus, or sometimes they'll add the first verse, but you don't actually often hear the entire piece. Many of the places that Ridley mentions in the song, like William Armstrong's works, the infirmary on Forth Banks, the dispensary in Nelson Street, and Bamburgh's Wheatsheaf, no longer exist, although obviously Bamburgh's Music Hall technically does because the building's still there. But the song ultimately preserves the sites that were once notable to locals, even though the infirmary is now the Royal Victoria Infirmary up near Newcastle University by Leazes Park. So it has just moved, but the original one is now the Centre for Life, if you're familiar with Newcastle. So what do we actually make of the Blaydon Races? Well, we do have to talk about the Blaydon Races as essentially three different things which all happen to bear the same name. So at the first point, we have the races as a given point in the calendar, and we have the idea that the success of the one in 1862 then fixed the date as being the 9th of June. And I think it's quite interesting the way that ties in with a lot of the stuff around things like the Newcastle hoppings on the town moor, and the way that particular events become part of a city's calendar. So while we often talk about things like rural events and rural ways of marking time with different festivals and feast days and so on, cities equally have their own thing, and that's where the Blaydon Races essentially became one of those for Newcastle. But they've been immortalised on that given date because of the song. So the song then preserved the tradition of going to see the Blaydon Races, and the song then has become part of Tyneside's fabric in a lot of ways. Like I say, it's become really associated with sporting events and things like that. And I suppose really when you consider what you hear some football fans chanting, hearing people singing the Blaydon Races is quite stirring, if I'm completely honest. I am massively biased as a Geordie, but you know what I mean? There's always one of those songs where you're like, I feel like I'm part of this group, but for good reasons, not bad ones. And I think that's something that we could all do with at the moment. But the interesting thing about it is the fact that the song preserving the tradition then also creates a new one, because the current Blaydon Races, which is obviously the athletics foot race, basically recreates the route from the song. So you wouldn't have the Blaydon Race as it is now if you hadn't had the song, and you wouldn't have the song if you hadn't had people going to see the Blaydon Races. So it's interesting how it's not only created a new tradition, but it's kind of also preserved the old one and then turned it into something new, which is now also part of the folk calendar of Newcastle and Gateshead and so on, which I think is quite interesting. But then how we imagine all of that is then a fourth prong, as it were, where that's all then down to the painting, which is very, very busy. I'm sure you'll agree. There's a lot going on in it. And much like the song, also captures a fictional point in time. But it also, again, figures how we view that and how we might think of that and so on. So while the current races are completely different, it's all drawn on this central point. And what's really interesting is the fact that we're essentially drawing from the point from 1862 Blaydon Races, which were the ones that obviously, like I say, immortalised in. So we're not drawn from the original ones in the 1830s. And we're not even really drawn on the ones from the 1890s right through to the civil unrest of 1916. That bit sort of all gets forgotten about because of this halcyon day in 1862, which everyone seems to remember, at least through the song. So I do think it's a really important way of looking at a particular moment in time through song, but then also art as well. And then also seeing how those have then gone on and created new traditions of their own. Because traditions always have to start somewhere. So we could look at the Blaydon Races now, date back to 1981, but that's still quite a long time ago. So it is quite interesting to see how these things work. Obviously, Blaydon Race is very, very different from the Great North Run, but that in and of itself has also become a major point in the calendar of Tyneside. So it's quite interesting how these different things become associated with a city. So I would be really interested to know, are there any songs from your city or your town, whether it's where you're from, where you live, whichever, doesn't really matter. And this also works worldwide as well. It doesn't have to just be in Britain. Are there any songs that preserve particular traditions or places or people or events, things like that? Things where you can look at the lyrics and learn a little bit about what went on. So this is the thing, you can look at the lyrics for the Blaydon Races and you can obviously see all of these places that no longer exist that trace the route. And then go, oh, I wonder what that was. I wonder where that might have been. And then you can go and have a look into them a little bit further and get to know your city a bit more. So, like I say, it's quite interesting. Do let me know what you come up with, because obviously this is actually a conversation, not just a monologue. And yeah, obviously I hope you enjoyed this particular episode about both sporting events and song. And we're going to have a look at a little bit more Tyneside music next week, particularly with the figure of Joe Wilson. So I hope that you enjoy that one as well. And yeah, I don't really have a lot much else to add to the end of this. So as always, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for reviews, recommending to friends, people who've become paid supporters on Patreon, Coffee or Substack, which I'm now on there, and you can get bonus episodes and exclusive articles on there as well if you prefer to read. So yeah, all of that does help me keep the podcast going, so it is much appreciated. But anyway, I'll let you crack on with whatever you were doing, and I'll see you next week. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. I don't get paid per play of the podcast like musicians do, so if you'd like to support the podcast so I can keep it ad-free and help me pay for all the annoying stuff like web hosting and cover the hours it takes me to make these episodes, then you can buy me a coffee on Coffee or become a member of the Fabulous Folklore family by becoming a paid supporter on Coffee, Patreon and Substack. Or you can leave a review, tell a friend, or share episodes on social media for free. It all helps.